Welcome to CIHT Podcasts.
Welcome to James Gleave, Director of Mobility Policy Lab. Thinker of big thoughts about transport strategy and how it all meshes together. You can find him on Twitter at JamesGleave1. And thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Via.
James, tell us a bit about Mobility Policy Lab.
Okay, so Mobility Policy Lab is, it's kind of a new startup company, I suppose you could describe it as. And what it is about is kind of an idea called citizen-centred mobility, where there's been a lot of talk about in the industry about how do we improve public participation in developing new strategies for transport for cities or for nations. There's also been lots of talk about from new mobility providers like WIM, Uber, those sorts of things about user-centred design. We've got to put the users at the heart of the transport system. And what Mobility Lab is all about is trying to understand kind of what that all means for transport policy and then develop tools to help policymakers to put the needs of citizens at the heart of their future transport strategies.
Sounds interesting. But what's the problem with current consultations? We do them well, we've done them for years, they seem to work.
It depends upon your interpretation, really. So I can work for many years in local authorities here in the UK, and I think on the application of public consultation, public engagement has been variable. Some places like I think, for example, the B Lines project in Greater Manchester, where they're improving the walking and cycling routes, they've been very open, they've been very engaging with the public, almost to the point whereby the public and their stakeholders are actually designing the cycle routes themselves and the sorts of infrastructure which they want, to almost kind of the permissive approach, which is we will write a strategy, we'll send it out for 8 weeks public consultation, we'll then invite people to make their comments, and then we'll review them and make any changes to the strategy which we see fit. And what that then leads to is that people, well, not just users, but people, citizens of areas, visitors to areas, then don't really kind of feel like they have a proper say in transport decisions, something which affects their everyday lives, or they don't understand why certain decisions have been made. So there is an opportunity now to apply new approaches to make our but not only our public consultation better, but actually, in effect, have citizens own the vision of mobility in their area, even if the local authority still actually goes away and does a lot of the delivering, which will probably still be the case.
That's interesting, because that will likely be the case. But then what's the role of experts in this? What's the role if citizens ask for something that may be impossible, expensive to deliver? How does that work?
So it all depends upon the process which you go through when you're working with citizens to establish what the vision for mobility is going to be in their area. Just to kind of not be confused, what I'm not saying is that citizens tell transport planners and transport professionals what they want, and then transport planners, policymakers and others should be expected to deliver it. If you ask people what they want, effectively they want the moon on a stick, really. And some of their demands are going to be competing. When they ask for particular schemes, they may not necessarily understand what the wider system implications are going to be. So the role of transport planners in that regard is to work with citizens and say, okay, we want you to own this vision of transport and mobility in this area, and we will work with you as part of this process to advise, to make recommendations, not least on things that may not be safe, may not be legal, what is going to be the implication of if say, you want to improve air quality through a clean air zone in a city. That's then going to have impact upon how much you can drive around the city and how much others can drive, and just get them to understand what the implications of these different initiatives are. So even if come the end of the process they may not necessarily agree with the specific initiatives and specific schemes which you progress, at least they'll understand why, and they'll understand what the reasons of that for. And of course you always get the kind of the vocal people who will kind of not be happy regardless. That's kind of part of the democratic process, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But so long as you take people then on that journey and say, this is what we can realistically do, and this is what then makes up a good vision, and work with them, then I see that's kind of perfectly viable role for professionals to play. And of course there may be instances when, let's say you have to turn around the strategy in about 2 weeks or so, where kind of the professionals may have to take the lead.
Yeah.
It's just kind of using our expertise in a different way.
Yeah, it's interesting. Some would say it's a little bit of an optimistic view in ways, but I guess it is about the process and how you do it.
Yeah.
So in that context, what are the type of skills and capabilities you think a modern transport planner needs to have?
Ooh, skills and capabilities. So it's kind of quite easy to get technical.
And attitude.
Yeah, I was about to say it's quite easy to kind of get technical in this regard. And there are of course all sorts of different platforms out there which are really good tools by which you can engage the public with. Notable example I can think of is Commonplace, for instance, who provides a platform where people can submit their comments and their perspectives on an area, and from that can then result in different schemes being developed, and it's kind of quite a flexible platform. But yeah, it's kind of much more of an attitude thing. It's more of how do you kind of change this mindset away from the professionals being in control of the process to giving up that degree of control on the decision to be made come the end of it. So you may kind of design an open and inclusive process, and you may ultimately be responsible for delivering kind of this public engagement or kind of user-centered research, all those different sorts of things. But you got to then approach it with a mindset that the best people to understand the needs of users are the users themselves and citizens themselves, whereas you come at it from the perspective of we understand what the impacts are going to be.
Yeah.
And that's kind of, it's kind of quite a challenging mindset to put forward, but I certainly kind of think there's appetite for it.
I think you're right. I'm going to push back slightly on one of those statements, is that the users know what they need and what they want. Because I think sometimes that's not the case at professional sake. One of the phrases we use here is that we want transport planners to move away from predict and provide model to having a vision for their local areas. The industry as a whole, local authorities need to think about what they want and deliver that, not simply predict. We're going to have this much more population, this much more motor traffic, let's build more roads. And one of the worries that you get into is when you're consulting is people look to what's happened in the past and say we need more of this. So radical opportunities like removing parking, like closing roads, etc. aren't really considered. I know you're going to say this is part of the process. And B, it can be really difficult to interpret what people's actual motives are. So we've seen a number of markets around London. So I'm going to take Roman Road as an example, where they surveyed business owners on how do you think people get to your shops? And the result was, well, they thought about 50% of people came by car. In reality, when they surveyed the users of those shops, it was less than about 15% came, because there's no parking, and most visitors are local in a dense urban area in East London. And what was really interesting when presented with that information and asked what would make this area better for you as a business owner, the argument came back: we need more parking.
Of course.
Which is really interesting because that's not serving them. That's the majority of your ownership. However, most of the shop owners are car drivers and do park in the area. So how do you kind of tackle these kind of distinctions and?
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, and in some senses, I do agree with you. When people are presented with the actual facts in the matter which challenge their own perception, their initial reaction is to be resistant against it. It's a perfectly human reaction, and studies in behavioural psychology, obviously it's behavioural science and kind of nudge theory, which kind of does the round every few years, it would seem, does indicate that when you present people just with facts and say, which challenge their own perceptions, their natural reaction is going to be resistant against it. So that is why, and it doesn't necessarily tie up very well with necessarily the processes of schemes and of strategies. You have to kind of take your citizens and your users almost on that learning journey and say, your perception of transport and mobility in the city or in the community, wherever it happens to be, is not necessarily wrong. But we have data which there says indicates otherwise, and indicates that other people's perceptions of transport and mobility is different to yours. And what you've then got to kind of think about is, what does that then mean when we're trying to provide a transport mobility system which provides for everybody, not necessarily just for you and for your user group. But also I think it's also about how do you then reframe the question in public consultation. So we're very good at going out and asking people what they want. And people can tell you what they want. Yeah. They will. Everybody's been through a public consultation process. Will say, well, actually, you can just move that bypass, half a kilometre that way, or they can say, right, okay, you can put in much better environmental improvements. Want. They all kind of want these things, but when you ask them what they need, that's a very different question to ask them, and it gets them to really focus on what they actually need to do. So in this, in this example, if you ask mobility, so the business owners kind of what they want, they'll say more car parking for their customers to be able to come get more people into their shops, generate profits, all those sorts of things. But when you kind of ask them what they need, in that instance, they're probably going to be responding and say, actually, I need car parking for my business, and I need some sort of mechanism by which I can accept deliveries, because obviously in many urban areas, deliveries are still done by van or they're done by lorry. When you tie up with the needs of others and say, actually, what I need to be able to do in order to get to shops, I need good walking routes, I need drop curbs, I basically need to be able to get to the shops and do my everyday life. That's when you comes an understanding which is completely different to what people say they want. And there are all sorts of techniques which you can use to do this. And then the final thing is, it's not just about asking people, but it's also about observing what they do. Yeah. And there are all sorts of ethnographical research methods where you just literally just observe people and kind of what they do and how they use public spaces, how they get around their daily lives. And that does take a lot of effort to do, but it generates probably significantly more insight, I would argue, than a simple passenger survey or handing out a survey at a public consultation event. It's there are all sorts of ways which you can do this. We just don't do it as often as we should.
Yeah, we should learn from our Jane Jacobs. So then, given that, what would your example of a mobility policy lab, not consultation, citizen-focused design, was that the phrase used, look like from the ground up? What do you do that's different? And what do you think other people should be doing that's different? There we go, we're recording.
Okay, so I can give you a couple of examples, actually. So the first example we had was a project which we've done in Scottish town of Inverurie with the Connected Places catapult and with a kind of local transport planner called Jenny Mill, where we undertook a discovery project there to understand whether a new type of rural mobility service, whether it be something like an on-demand transport service or a mobility as a service style solution, would meet unmet needs in Scottish town of Inverurie. So for those of you who don't know Inverurie, it's reasonably small Scottish town, just outside Aberdeen. And obviously there's rural accessibility issues there. So we did some data analysis of mobility issues in the town itself. We also went out and did street interviews and engaged with local stakeholders and local residents to really start to tease out what their needs are, and then through a collaborative design process started to sketch out what those new rural mobility services might look like. So in some instances they may be very similar to stuff which you could argue transport planners would come up with, so things like integrated ticketing. How do you then better integrate with health services, for instance? But the process which we then went through is we designed it collaboratively with community and kind of the representatives of the community based upon their needs, as opposed to we doing some high level data analysis, saying this is a problem here, we got to provide a new mobility service. So that was kind of one example of the process which we went through. And for those of you who haven't done a discovery project before, the whole purpose of the project, those sorts of projects, is to understand what the user needs are and what a potential solution could look like, rather than almost like a technical feasibility piece of work, which is what is technically feasible here. And that then may move on to a further stage where we actually look to prototype, to design the sorts of solution. The second example is something we actually did for transport planners, which was Transport Planning Camp in Leeds in November of last year. So it's kind of first of its type event, which is kind of an unconference, which I'll go on to in a moment, but I should kind of put a shout out to the collaborator, so the people who we collaborated with on this event, which is Pavel Bugajewski from Arup, Laura Putt from Transport for London, and Anna Rovney from Shift Mobility, without which basically this event wouldn't have happened. So the type of event it was an unconference, where rather than go into the event with a set agenda in mind, we got the attendees at the event to develop the agenda themselves on the day. So they came up with suggestions for particular sessions. Obviously, we provided the room, we provided all the refreshments, and we guided them through the process of actually choosing the sorts of sessions which they want, because as you can imagine, with 50 people there are 50 different perspectives on the sorts of sessions which they want. And there's only 12 sessions which you can actually realistically run in a day. So we took them on a process of brainstorming potential session ideas, to get them to vote on the ones which they actually wanted, and sort an agenda from there, and then work with some other volunteers to actually facilitate those sessions. And whilst the event itself was kind of themed around transport needs of future generations. In reality, we discussed a whole variety of subjects, from freight to social impact, social justice, and what was kind of really quite refreshing about the day was, well, firstly, it was actually a very positive event itself, but quite how much the transport planners and people from other sectors, by the way, really got engaged with the format and really were very active participants throughout the day. And the day was then really focused upon actions and actually doing things rather than kind of death by PowerPoint, you could say. And that was kind of a real eye-opener, come for myself personally, and also for the others as well, on the value of just giving that degree of power over to, in this case, what your users would be the young conference participants, and say, we're going to facilitate all of this, but it's up to you to set the agenda, set the energy for the day. And when you set up the right sort of environment in order to do that, people can flourish, and they did on that day in Leeds. So it was a really positive day.
So I know you're working with one of our colleagues at CIHT here, Teresa Jolly. Can you tell us a little bit more about that project?
The big thing we're doing at the moment is we're actually doing a discovery project on Mobility Lab itself. So I'm working with Teresa Jolly and Nick Carey of the West Midlands Data Discovery Centre, Chloe Sharp of the User-Centred Design and Consultancy SnapOut, as well as a few other people, on just trying to discover what necessarily the level of demand for a service like Mobility Policy Lab will provide, but also, in fact, what's the user need for all this sort of service out there? Because it's very easy to get into a position and try and build a service and provide the service which you actually think people want, but without actually going out and understanding the needs of transport planners, ironically. It's very easy to get that wrong, and it's very easy to develop something which may be technically excellent and it may be an absolutely brilliant thing to do, but it won't meet a user need. So, in effect, we are taking our own approach and own philosophy and applying it to ourselves. And so at the moment we are basically understanding what the user needs are of transport planners, policy makers, and people who have an interest in transport planning and policy making. That's not just the usual stakeholders, say transport operators, civic groups, or particular campaign groups as well, but also needs of communities as well. So we're home in the next few months. We're actually going to be going out and interviewing we'll be going out interviewing policymakers and interviewing these different target audiences to understand what their user needs are, and then build upon our existing service offer, a new service offer, essentially. So, and I'm also working with Anna Rovney on another discovery project, which is looking into developing a policy diagnostic tool as well. So,
sounds great. Really interesting. So, just wrapping up now. You've been in the transport planning industry for a while. Right now, CIHT is producing a piece of advice on better integrating planning and transport. And one of the things that's really interesting is how long people have been trying to do this for, how long we've been trying to improve as a sector. What's your perspective? Do you think we're going to improve as a country?
Yes.
Thank you. Very short and simple answer. Thank you very much, James Gleave.
Thank you.